Thank you, everyone. This is the second session for our day, our genealogy live streaming event and live program. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Deborah Dudak. I'm from the Fountaindale Public Library in Bolingbrook. And this session is Sensational Deaths and How to Find Them with Tina Beaird. Tina is a wonderful, amazing, fantastic librarian from the Plainfield Public Library, and she has a lot of really great tips and hints for how to conduct a lot of genealogical research using a lot of sources. But if your ancestors may have died horribly, or if they died horribly, this is going to be the best session that you will ever experience. So please give Tina a warm round of applause. Thank you very much.
You guys know Deborah's my BFF. I can tease her because she'll take it. So, what is a sensational death? When somebody dies tragically, does that necessarily mean that it's sensational? If somebody dies in an unfortunate accident or dies as a child, does that necessarily mean it's sensational? So I'm going to show you a screenshot here. What do we see? On this one page alone, Eastland disaster, submarine sinking, you have brutal massacres, you have Austrians being evacuated. So any newspaper that you read every day sensationalizes death. Sometimes for genealogists like us, we love that. Because I'm sure if all of you are sitting here, you geek out about sensational deaths and homicides and tragedies as much as I do. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here right now. So what constitutes sensational? So I'm going to give you an example. So scrapbooks sometimes will include memorial cards, for people who died young. You might have heard family lore, somebody was killed on a runaway wagon. You might have heard that somebody drowned at a young age. So you can kind of put that story together with the scrapbook information that you have. Died suddenly should be a big red flag. When you're reading an obit or a death notice and it says died suddenly, there's got to be something juicy there. Hopefully not too juicy, but something juicy in that information. When you have the same date or sequential dates for families or people buried in the same section of the cemetery, again, that should be something that would have been sensationalized most likely. The Eastland section at, Bohemian National Cemetery or Forest Home Cemetery, the Titanic section up at the cemetery up in Newfoundland. So, there are things like that that are going on. So, Professor Harry Darnell is an example from Plainfield, because I work in Plainfield. And Harry Darnell died in a very tragic way. He was an aerial artist. He would do stunts on a hot air balloon. He's down in the bottom corner down there. You can see him dangling from his balloon. Professor Darnell fell to his death in front of hundreds of spectators at Electric Park in Plainfield. And the newspaper articles that were picked up at the time ran all over the United States. So not only was it sensational in our local area because people were familiar with Harry Darnell and actually saw him plummet to his death into the DuPage River, but he was a well-known figure in the Midwest. So it got picked up by all kinds of papers because people were familiar with his stunts. The newspaper article that you see here talks about how nobody had claimed his body, that family was contacted and nobody responded. So the good citizens of Plainfield raised the funds to have him buried in Plainfield Township Cemetery and pay for his headstone. His coroner's inquest record states, that from an accident he fell to his death in Plainfield about 6:30 p.m., July 26, 1911. And it lists the witnesses of the people who were called to testify within the verdict. And even his headstone has a picture of his hot air balloon, and it says, again, erected by the good citizens of Plainfield, Illinois. Would that be considered a sensational death or just a tragic accident? Because it was picked up by the newspapers, because it was sensationalized in so many different places, that's kind of what we consider when we're thinking about sensational deaths. There are people who are dying within the public eye. Big events, railroad bridge collapse, train accidents, Eastland disasters, ship disasters, things like that. But the small town deaths, suicides, and homicides get picked up by the AP as well. And sometimes you find those things in the most unlikely of places. So at the very end of my presentation, I have some case studies that I'll show you from the great big disaster to the personal tragedy and how they were sensationalized and how you can find that information as well. Epidemics, pandemics, disasters and tragedies, these are the kind of things that usually create a lot of paperwork in one way or another. So epidemics and pandemics usually don't show up in newspapers as much as a disaster would, but you'll still find things like quarantine notices, how to brace yourself for the flu or the smallpox, or families that have been quarantined because they're contagious. You'll read in newspapers about schools, businesses being closed to try to control the spread of whatever disease it happened to be. So newspapers are a great source to find some of this information. Even if you didn't have an ancestor who died, they might have just caught the disease and managed to survive it, like the flu pandemic. So while the flu killed millions of people in 1918 and 1919, there were millions of people who survived it as well. And you'll find that information in the newspapers, not just the deaths showing up in coroner's records and in hospital records. Diphtheria was another very real outbreak that took place in the 1870s, 1878, 79. It happened again in the 1920s. So you think by the 20s, 30s, and 40s, we're outgrowing these pandemics, but that's certainly not the case. Look at polio in the 40s and 50s. So this isn't a historical thing. Many of us probably had family members who either had caught the flu or had caught diphtheria or who had had polio. So we can use what we've heard from the family, put that to good use by looking through newspapers and looking through hospital records and books written on the particular epidemic or pandemic to get a better understanding of exactly how many people were affected outside of your immediate family, but within your community. So here's a couple of examples. These are all flu pandemic. How many of you had ancestors who were caught up in the flu pandemic in 1918 and 1919? How many survived? How many died? Okay, so when you're reading newspaper accounts, they'll give you lists of the dead, of people who have succumbed to the epidemic, but then they will also give you newspaper accounts of the people who have been quarantined and the people who survive. This is great for military research. Believe it or not, newspapers were picking up what was going on in the surrounding camps, whether it's Fort Riley or whether it's Camp Grant or wherever it happens to be. So as soldiers are dying because of the flu epidemic, not only is it being written up in the soldiers' hometown newspaper, but it's written up in either the camp newspaper, the Fort Dodger if they were at, the Camp Dodger if they were at Camp Dodge in Iowa. Camp Grant had a local newspaper as well. Great Lakes Naval Base had a newspaper as well. They were writing up those boys who were succumbing and dying, as well as the newspapers in that community. So the city of Chicago was writing about Great Lakes. Rockford was writing about Camp Grant. And you're finding these articles just by using newspapers. And then you're even lucky enough sometimes to get a photo of your soldier if you can happen to find them. You can take that information then, and you can go to other resources to look for more information. The little screenshot that you see in the top corner, that's the Anderson family who had succumbed to the flu. The problem is when you're looking at death records, one thing to keep in mind is especially when you're looking during the flu pandemic, flu isn't always listed as the cause of death when you're looking at death records and death certificates. They died normally of bronchial infections, whether it's bronchitis, whether it's pneumonia, whether it's some kind of other lung problem, coinciding with influenza. So when you're looking for your friends, you're looking for your ancestors, helping your friends research their families, and they're looking in that period, and they say, oh, they didn't die of the flu, they had pneumonia. It's all still relative to the same infection. There are a couple websites here for you that list worldwide epidemics. I'm kind of geeky, so I get a kick out of these things. But there are books as well that'll give you that same kind of information. So Simon Will's book is a great resource. Deb has it here at her library. I have it at my library. How Our Ancestors Died. So it gives you alphabetical explanations. So if you see marasmus on a death certificate, or if you see, variola, which is what we would call smallpox, and it gives you an explanation of what all those different types of death are. Dropsy, consumption, how many different ways can you say tuberculosis, right? There's a bunch of ways. So using a resource like this can be really helpful to you when you're investigating causes of death. Disasters and tragedies create a lot more paperwork than disease, than epidemics and pandemics. Because while an epidemic is tragic and it causes lots of people to die in a short period of time, it's nobody's fault per se, unless you're like me and you're a descendant of the Mongol horde and we're responsible for bringing Black Death to Europe. I apologize. Disasters and tragedies have a fall guy. There's somebody at fault, which creates a lot of paperwork. Not only will you find newspaper accounts of what was going on, but you're going to find governmental paperwork as well. There's going to be hearings, there's going to be investigations, there's going to be lawsuits. There's a lot of additional paperwork that gets created when somebody needs to blame. Eastland disaster is a good example. I can't use that as a case study because it's way too big, but I'll touch on it briefly. Just the fact that, you have arrests. The captain had to be arrested and he was tried, whether or not he was at fault for the reason why the boat capsized. So there's always somebody who is to blame when you run into these scenarios. Coroner's office is going to have inquests that you can find. You might be able to find copies of them to use in your research. But federal and local court records can really shed a lot of light because a lot of times there's criminal investigations and there are lawsuits brought by the family against who they feel is the perpetrator. So that's where you're going to find the meat on the bones, so to speak, the information of the court testimony and the people they talk to and the witnesses and the photos and the evidence. That's where you're going to find all of that. You're not going to find it necessarily in a coroner's inquest, but you're going to be able to find it through local court records. So now what if you're at the cemetery and you just kind of stumble upon a section or a family that all seem to fall into that same range of deaths? So where can you start looking? Ask the cemetery, what happened here? Why do all these people have the same date of death? Or is there a section dedicated to this particular event? The photo that I had on the previous slide was a monument for the children who died in the Our Lady of Angels fire. Not all of the children that are on that monument are buried at Queen of Heaven Cemetery, but it's a nice list of everybody who was involved in that fire who lost their lives. So sometimes using markers in one place can lead you to information that might actually take you to a different cemetery, possibly even a different town. But by being able to use those memorials and those markers, it can put you on the right track if you didn't know that that's the reason why a family member died at such an early age. Always see if there are other names near you or other dates near you that are going to be similar to that date. Epidemics and pandemics, it gets a little loose because you might not register in your mind all of a sudden that you might have December 6th and then December 9th and then December 12th. And you might not put that together right away, as opposed to everybody having July 24th as their date of death. That sticks in your mind pretty quickly. Like I said, here's a newspaper account on the Eastland, and who was to blame? Right? Somebody has to be to blame. You can't have a tragedy like this without somebody taking responsibility for it. So newspapers are a great way, and I'm going to show you a case study when I talk about the Iroquois Theater fire, about newspapers really giving you all of those details that you're not getting through other sources. But don't just stop at coroners, court records, and newspapers. There are a lot of other sources where you can find some of this information as well. Libraries, you're all sitting here today, historical societies, museums. Most people have a tendency to overlook archives, university archives, and special collections. The local community college might have a lot of information. See, as Adam had mentioned earlier about the difference between local history and genealogy, a university and a college is interested in local history. An event like the Eastland disaster, the Iroquois Theater fire, the Triangle fire, the Great Chicago fire, they're going to be collecting histories and books and documentation on that. They're not necessarily worried about all of the individuals that were involved. They want the history of the event as a whole. So sometimes you can go to places like Governor State University and find some really good information, or University of Chicago in Hyde Park to find information on a particular event, not necessarily a single family name, to receive some of that information. I was talking about the Eastland a minute ago, and I went to Bohemian Cemetery this week to look at the Eastland section 16 that's at Bohemian National Cemetery. And I asked the lady at the counter, I said, I'm looking for this headstone. And she said, what was the date? I said, it was July 1915. It was for the Eastland. And she said, well, are you family? She was very excited about it. And I said, no, I'm just doing research. You've all experienced this. She was like, oh. Call these people. And she gave me the phone number for the Czech-Slovak group. I love the Czech-Slovak group, and I've used their resources, and they do have a lot of information on the Eastland disaster, but that wasn't what I was after. What I was after was the location of the headstones so I could photograph them for my research. So small-time societies, small museums, libraries, archives are going to have bits and pieces of that research that are going to point you in a direction to find out exactly what happened to your ancestor, whether they perished in the event or whether they were a survivor. Historical societies and universities also might have oral histories or interviews that they did with some of the survivors or descendants before they died. If there are people still alive, ask if you can contact them. Ask them if you can interview them and ask them questions about the event. And the reason being, and when I talk about military, I'm going to give a military example towards the end. The Veterans Oral History Project is a perfect example of that, because it's individuals telling the stories of their military experience and their unit, and they're talking about other people by name, their buddies, their friends who were shot and killed or who were wounded, and you're getting that personal detail about your individual that you might not find anywhere else. So ask if there are people that you can interview and ask questions. What kind of books or articles have been written on the subject? Does the library or the society have them? If they don't, where can I find them? So use your local resources as well. Don't just stop at what you find online. How many of you have used funeral home records? Sometimes we're lucky enough that they're going to provide that little bit of extra information. The vast majority of time, you're not going to get any genealogical data whatsoever. You're not going to get birth parents. You might get a date of birth, but you're not going to get any of that extra genealogical research. But what you are going to get is the information based on the death, which is what we want. If it's a tragedy, if it's a sensational death, if it's a homicide or a suicide, the funeral home record is going to have that information. They're going to give you the cause of death. They might be able to provide a little bit more background information. Funeral home might also have the records of not only your family who perished and were taken care of by that funeral home, but all of the people associated with that event as well. So if there were 13 people who all went to the same funeral home to be prepared for burial, they might have that information and might make that information available to you. But it'll have things like how much it cost for the hearse or the livery carriages, if they were embalmed, if they were cremated, how much the casket cost. Why this is useful. It's the old adage of go big or go home. When somebody dies tragically, that's when you get all of the extra money that pours in for flowers and for singers and for extra cars and for all of that extra that goes around the actual event. So you would find it listed in the funeral home records. If they had received 55 donations of flower arrangements, they're going to document that in some way. And then you can find out what was going on around that event. Date of death it'll give you, place of burial it'll give you. So then once you know where they're buried, then you can go to the cemetery and ask for that additional information. But what the funeral home records can provide is a snapshot of what their socioeconomic status was. I'm going to say the name wrong, the Sindler family who died on the Eastland, the entire family was wiped out. That funeral was paid for, that money was raised and paid for by the city of Chicago as well as individuals who had donated, because it was such a tragedy when you wipe out an entire family. So you'll see newspaper accounts and images of this funeral where they're trying to get them to the cemetery and you've got the caskets stacked in rows from one family, 3 on the bottom, 3 on the top, kind of stacked across each other. So that was a huge funeral that involved a lot of work, and the funeral home would have those records about exactly how they took care of that how they took care of the arrangements for that event. So you can get some really good information out of funeral home records. This isn't our first rodeo. We've been doing this for a while. We're a little bit familiar with how to find death certificates and death registers, but there are a couple of things that I want to point out that we have a tendency to overlook that could provide some really good information for you. So death certificate information varies by state, it varies by county, and it varies by date of death. 1877 is when the state of Illinois starts recording that information, and the death certificates really did not provide a lot of genealogical data. It doesn't tell you parents' names. It doesn't tell you parents' place of birth. That comes later. But sometimes you'll find information like, is the inquest box checkmarked on the death certificate? So now you know that there was an investigation into that cause of death. It's going to tell you where they died. So in this particular case, this is a record for the Norfolk State Mental Institution in Nebraska. Now I know that I'm going to be looking for information on that death from insane asylum records if I can find it. Oh, okay. Uh-oh. How did I just do that? So some information that you can get from death certificates can provide that information that maybe something happened there that wasn't a natural cause of death. Right on the death certificates, it's going to tell you how they died. How many of you have ancestors who have died in Cook County, in Chicago? Do any of you have inquest records from Chicago or know that you had family who died? What's interesting about Cook County that they don't do in the suburbs out here is that you had a temporary death certificate. How many of you have copies of the temporary death certificates? And then once they did the inquest and the investigation, then it'll say permanent death certificate across it. And the two of them are filed together. So the temporary just gives you very basic information, and it'll usually say cause of death unknown. Always make sure it doesn't say temporary. Make sure that you're getting the permanent certificate. And then on the permanent certificate, it'll give you the cause of death. Death by homicide, death by drowning, death by suicide, accident, whatever it happened to be. So Cook County is one of those exceptions to where there's more than one death certificate at a given time. Death certificate numbers come from death registers. So some counties will have digitized their death registers and not their certificates. Some might have done it the other way around. We've all used the LDS Family Search website. How many of us have ordered microfilm from LDS Church and used them? So same with the microfilm. They might have the death registers on one microfilm, and they might have the death certificates on another. It's not the same information. So, like I said, what denotes tragic? Is a baby who dies that's stillborn, it's tragic, but is it sensational? On a death register, if a baby's born stillborn, it'll give you the midwife's name. On the death certificate, it gives you the attending physician. You're not getting the same information. So you always want to look at both, just in case, if both exists, because you're going to find bits and pieces of information on the death register that might not show up on the death certificate. So if you don't have both, try to go back and get both so that you're getting all the information. Death registers are also created chronologically. So how many of us have found that our death or our birth for our ancestor wasn't recorded until 5, 6, 7, 8 months later? Because it's done chronologically. So if I'm looking for a death certificate, it'll give the date of death. But if I'm looking in a death register, I need to know when it was recorded. So if they died in February in the middle of a snowstorm, that doctor might not have come in to record it until after the event, or at the beginning of the next quarter. So how many of you have looked at death registers and there's like 85 people who died and were recorded April 11th? They didn't all die April 11th. That's when the doctors came in at the start of the new quarter and registered all their deaths on the same date. So make sure that you're looking for these chronologically. I found one, a little girl who died that was recorded 6 years after her date of death. How would you ever find that? I just stumbled across it by accident. So whatever the event was, maybe the doctor lost the paperwork, maybe he found it in a drawer somewhere and realized his error, but it was recorded 6 years after the little girl's date of death. So sometimes you have to go really far ahead. Here's an example. Here's an epidemic/pandemic. You have John Koppel, Julia Koppel, William Koppel, George Koppel. Look at the years. 5 years, 8 years, 3 years, 2 years. And the dates. December 19th, December 25th, December 26th, December 27th. One right after another. All of these children died of diphtheria. And they're all recorded in the register on the same date. They were all recorded December 31st, but they died within 10, 12 days of each other. So when you're looking at registers, you're a lot better off than looking at certificates, because for a disaster or a pandemic, they're all going to kind of be filed in the same order, and it clues you in right away that something was going on when they're all listed right after another. With a death certificate, you can kind of get out of sync and not realize that they're all part of the same event. but with a register, it makes it really easy to identify right away. Burial transfer permits. You guys have had speakers who have come in and talked about burial transfers and removing the dead. Some counties will file them chronologically at the date of the event when the body is brought to that particular county. Some wait and do it quarterly, just like doctors did with death registers. So for Will County, for example, they did them at the start of each quarter. So if there were 5 bodies that were moved from one state or one county to Will County for burial, they listed them all together at the beginning before they went on to their chronological lists of deaths. It just depends on how the county does them. So what happened was, the certificate is only going to give you the information about transporting the body. It's not going to give you any information on who their parents are. It's not going to give you any of that. But in order to transport a body, they could not be contagious. So if you had a contagious disease, your body couldn't be shipped. It had to be buried where it was. They would not transport you. So that's something to keep in mind also. So it would mark right on the transfer permit, are they contagious? No. Somebody had to go with the body. You weren't shipping it UPS. Somebody had to be on the train with Wells Fargo taking the body from one location to another. Somebody had to be there to keep an eye on it in case it might have gotten up and walked away. And then somebody at the other end, when you reach your county, had to sign off on it. If there was a burial without a funeral, the cemetery sexton or the trustees would be responsible for accepting the body. If there was a funeral, then it would go to the funeral home and the funeral director would sign off on it. It was their responsibility, whether it's the cemetery or the funeral director, it was their responsibility to make sure that the paperwork got filed with the county. How reliable do we think this is? I rest my case. So sometimes you can find them, sometimes you can't. It's not necessarily the county's fault, unless it's Will County. If they're listening, it's all your fault. Or, it could be the responsibility of the cemetery sexton who just never thought it was important enough to turn in. So you can go to the county and they'll look at you like you have 3 heads when you say, I'd like to see the burial transfer permits, please. What? So sometimes you can get lucky, sometimes you can't. We're lucky in the fact that the LDS Church microfilmed a lot of these, so you'll find them on the microfilm reels or in the digitized records, even when the county tells you that they can't find them or they don't exist. So thank you to Family Search for making these accessible. What gets filed is a copy of the transfer and the death certificate. So if your body's being transferred from Denver, Colorado to Joliet, Illinois, a death certificate from Arapahoe County would be filed with Will County and Joliet, along with a copy of the transfer certificate. So as we can see from some of these, it gives the cause of death, tells us where they died, it gives us when they died, and who shipped the body. But what are we missing? We have no date of birth, we have no parents' names, we have no address of where they used to live. So keep in mind that this is great information to tell you, I'm not looking for a death certificate in DuPage County. I'm looking for a death certificate in Armentrout, West Virginia. So the burial transfer permits can lead you in another direction, even if there's no genealogical data associated with it. Some of us have used coroner's inquests. I find it terribly exciting. I love looking at coroner's inquest records. Some of you have heard me tell the story about the inquest that I found once where they give you a description of your personal effects. So they tell you the name of the person, if they know it. It might say unknown male or unknown baby. They'll give you the details about the person, height, weight, things like that, their personal effects, the witnesses that happened to be there at the time of the event. It'll tell you the family members who are claiming the body. Well, in this one that I had, under personal effects, he had 1 sock, he had a shirt, and a pocket watch. And my question was, where did he put the pocket watch? So sometimes just reading the personal effects can be a good time. So it'll tell you the list of jurors. Now, a lot of counties would do them quarterly, and you would have the same jurors that would hear every case within that county for that particular quarter. So it might have been the April inquest, and you have 6 people who would listen to all of those cases. More recently, you would have a turnover where you would have 5 cases or 10 cases, it'd be the same people, and then you'd have a new list of jurors. You can find those in the newspapers. A lot of counties would run classifieds, and then right next to it, they'd run courthouse news. And in the courthouse news, they would list the inquests for that period and who the jurors were. So that sometimes can tee you off to more information, because if the newspaper has been digitized, you're going to pick up on that name, even if you didn't know there was an inquest, and it's going to point you to where you can find those coroner's records. They'll also tell you the witnesses, and they'll give you their occupations. So if it's a train accident, you'll get a lot of people like engineers and conductors. The housewife, they'll interview the wife if something happens. So sometimes it puts people together in their socioeconomic context as well. And then the verdict, whether they came to death by an accident or by their own hand. I have one that the verdict is that the doctor overestimated his ability to ligate a vessel. They called the doctor right out for being incompetent. It was wonderful. So sometimes you get some good stuff in there. And they did name the doctor by name. For those of you who are squeamish, don't look. Sometimes you'll find extra bonuses in the coroner's inquest records as well. So this poor guy, who happened to have been crushed, they included a photo from, when they brought his body in for the inquest. Sometimes you'll find newspaper accounts tucked inside. Sometimes you get some good things in there. Later inquests, 20th century inquests, some of those will still have the testimony that goes along with it. So I was able to find one from Kane County in Aurora, where it was a car accident where the pedestrian was struck by a car and died, and it was a 47-page inquest, where it had the witnesses, it had the verdict, but then it also had all of the testimony for all of the people who were brought into court to hear this particular inquest. Kane County charges like $5 per page. I said, just give me the front page. I wasn't about to pay 47 pages at $5 a piece for it, but a lot of times you can go in and read them. Another one that I have here is from DuPage County. What happened to poor Eddie Trent was he had gone into a building to get warm, Normantown Railroad, if any of you are familiar with Normantown. He had gone into the building to get warm at Frontenac. He worked for Normantown, backed up, had gotten too close to the flywheel, and got sucked in, smashed to the ground. So the inquest tells the story about how the kids who were with him came running out of the building to get his dad, who was still standing outside, screaming, and just the chaos of what ensued afterwards. And in this inquest, it gives all the details of his father picking up his crushed body and carrying him upstairs, and then having to go home and tell his mother and his wife. He had only been married for 8 months, and tell his wife that he had been killed. So again, inquests, sometimes if you can get this additional testimony, can give you a lot more information. Sometimes you can get it from newspapers. I love online resources. We all use online resources. It would be ridiculous for me to tell you, no, you have to go to New York State to get this information on your ancestor. We start here. It's just easier. We're curious. We're up at 3 a.m. We're in our pajamas looking for information on dead people. So I have to mention the places, not in detail, I'm only going to give you a couple, but some of the places where I go when I'm looking for sensational deaths. Like I said, military information, Fold 3 is my go-to place. Deb has Fold 3 here available through the library. I have it at my library. Wartime creates a lot of sensational deaths, let's be honest about it. People who are killed in engagements and in skirmishes, ships sink, things go on. Well, what Fold 3 has is it has those military records. It has court-martial proceedings if another soldier accidentally or intentionally kills another person. The Southern Claims Commissions, you guys got to have Deb and I reprise our Civil War presentation where she does her best Southern Claims Commission reporting in the tone of a heart-sickened Southern belle. Military headstone applications, if somebody's killed in action, it's going to be in the paperwork. War diaries. How many of you, you mentioned having letters home during the insurrection. How many of you have these letters and diaries? That tell that story of your ancestor as they served, your veteran as they served during these engagements. Orphans' homes records, right? If you're an orphan for a reason, right? And it's usually because something pretty tragic happened. So some orphans' home records are available through Fold 3 as well, which can give you some additional information on what exactly befell the parents at that particular time. Now, they tout it as being Facebook for the dead. You guys know that I laugh about that, because you can create your own ancestor pages. So like we saw with History Lines, it gives you a timeline, and it gives you significant events that happened in the life of that particular individual. But then you can add your own information. And I love this photo because you see how he's sitting there holding a skull? Like, what is up with that? And whose skull is it, and why does he have it? And why did the person who posted the photo think that that was the best choice of a photo for Mr. Loring Jr., you know? So there's a lot of questions that you have to ask there. But Fold 3 is a great resource to use to find some of that information. So for me, when I was looking for information on Earl Rockenbach, who was on the USS Indianapolis, Fold 3 actually had some of that information that it could provide me about what happened during the event and the names of the rosters of the soldiers who were aboard ship. So don't overlook Fold 3 as a chance to find some of that. What Fold 3 also has is it also has newspapers, it also has city directories, it also has vital records. It has Texas and Massachusetts births and deaths. You know, so again, you can get that original death certificate if they died in Texas, and then it might have inquest listed on it, or it might say cause of death was, you know, run over by a beer wagon like my ancestor was. And then you've got a place to start without having to necessarily go to Texas in order to do it. So Fold 3 is a really good resource for some of that. You guys know how much I love Internet Archives, right? Because you've heard me talk about the Grateful Dead collection in Internet Archives. You know how much I love it. Again, it's still the dead, whether it's this dead or that dead. It's all the dead. So how many of you are using Internet Archives for this sensational kind of record keeping? So what Internet Archives is going to have on it is it's going to have books that are outside of copyright, but it also has a lot of government documents on it. It has a lot of government information on it, and it has individual collections that have been curated and uploaded to it as well. So the Newberry Library, the Library of Congress, National Archives, Canadian National Archives, the National Library of Scotland, all have collections in here. There are over 2,100 genealogy collections that are within Internet Archives. But what it's going to give us are original books and stories and articles about the Eastland, the Iroquois Theater fire, the Triangle fire, the Shirtwaist Factory fire. You know, all kinds of information is going to be available through Internet Archives, and it's going to be free to download. It's not going to cost you anything. The downside is when you get caught in Google Books, because some of them are only uploaded through Google Books and you don't have the option to get around that. But it's a great way for you to take some of your information and make it available to other researchers. So for those of you who had an ancestor who was caught up in one of these sensational events, you can take that information and documentation and upload it in an Internet Archive so somebody else who's researching that same event can come along and then contact you and use your information. I mentioned the Iroquois Theater fire. I'm going to talk about Two Sisters. But there are all kinds of books available in here for the Iroquois Theater fire. So the Great Chicago Theater Disaster, which is a microfilmed copy of the events in the sensational story that revolved around the fire. The book was put out that following year. Because it's out of copyright, it's now available through Internet Archives. So I was able to download this book completely accidentally, not necessarily looking for the Harbaugh sisters, but finding this book, searching under Plainfield to see, okay, who might be listed that died that was from Plainfield? And there they both were. So you might not even know or have a connection, but you stumble across it because you come across a book that's been put online that provides that information for you. Other places where you can find this, Digital Public Library has books that are out of copyright. Family Search has a great book collection. Family Search leans more towards genealogies, not necessarily tragic events. Google Books, Hathi Trust, JSTOR for articles, journal articles, and more scholarly research on a topic is going to fall through JSTOR. If you haven't used JSTOR before, anybody who gets a community college library card, so whether it's COD in DuPage, whether it's Joliet Junior College, you can get a card. I live in Kendall County, so I would go to Waubonsie. You are welcome to get a card at any community college within your county for free, costs you nothing. Once you get that library card, you have access to things like this. You have access to the World Catalog. You have access to JSTOR. You have access to all of these publications by getting a free library card from your community college. So take advantage of it because JSTOR has stuff that you can't necessarily find anywhere else that might lead you on a path of discovery. I know many of you have heard my lecture on newspapers. This is our source, right? This is where we're getting the bulk of our information, whether it's a digitized newspaper that's online or whether it's a newspaper clipping that your mother might have saved from when you were the queen in the third grade pageant. Newspapers are our source for that personal history. So you cannot do a search on a tragic event, on a sensational event, without turning to newspapers. It just won't happen. Some of them are digitized and you can search them. When you're using sites like Ancestry, newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank, you don't have to put in a name. You have to keep in mind that you can search for particular events without ever having to put in a surname. So Genealogy Bank is a good example, and I'll show a slide of that, where I just did a search on Haymarket Riot because I had an ancestor who was a police officer who was killed in the Haymarket riots. I did a search, and it highlighted all the newspaper articles where the Haymarket Riot was mentioned, both at the time of the actual event, 10th anniversary, 15th anniversary, 100th anniversary, right? So people are still talking about certain events long after the dust has settled. So you might not have a newspaper index online for that particular year, but there might be an article written about that event 10, 20, 50, 75 years later, and that might be online then. And it's going to provide you the same information. Sometimes they'll recycle the same original article 25 years later, and now you have those names and those dates, whereas the original paper wasn't available online. How many of you have used cards of thanks as a way to find some of this death information? Cards of thanks typically were Catholic most often, but not always. But they would be things like, the family wishes to thank the community for their support, because of this tragic event. And some of the times they'll tell you exactly what happened. Our mother was taken from us at a young age, and they'll give you some good information in there. You don't have to have a specific date. I love year in review columns. How many of you have used year in review columns to find some of that personal information? Right? Because the last issue of the year or the first issue of the next year, they're going to have a chronological index of everything that went on that was reported in that newspaper in that previous year. So whether little Johnny fell off his horse and broke his leg, which might have run in the June 3rd newspaper, they might have the list of obits or the list of death notices chronologically. So on January 5th, you might find out that that obit for that person ran on March 25th. You don't have to go through an entire year worth of paper. You just have to look for the first issue. And sometimes that can provide that information. Big, tragic, sensational events are going to be in those year in review columns because they were big news within that community at the time. So once you get that date, then you know where you're going back to look for. Things were picked up by the AP. People have a tendency to think that the AP is a recent phenomenon. The AP predates the Civil War. The AP started in the 1850s. So on slow news days, you can find things, all kinds of crazy things, from all over the US. I have a newspaper article that I use in my courthouse class where I talk about sneezing is not grounds for divorce. And it was an AP story about a wife who filed for divorce from her husband in Boston, and it ran in the Joliet paper, because the husband sneezed in her face while he was eating. And the judge says, that's not grounds for divorce. Forgive him. Slow news day? Really? So sometimes you can find those big events, even if your paper isn't online, being reported on in other places. So when I talk about the tragic death of Ada Smith in my case studies, you'll see how that can happen. In the bottom, you see how Haymarket Riot, it's a terrible slide just because it's so tiny. But I was just looking on Haymarket Riot, and it brought up all the references to this. Can you read it? Police heroes killed in battles with thugs. So it lists the Haymarket Riot among those thug battles that were taking place. This is from the Chicago Tribune. Things like the Lusitania shooting, or sinking. But other things, these two shootings are probably two of my personal favorites. I told you I was twisted. So the one on the far right, Hazel Blackadder, known as Bubbles to police, so apparently they were very familiar with Bubbles, had shot and killed her boyfriend, her live-in boyfriend, because she was worried that he was going to kill her dog, because he said, and I quote, "I'm going to take that dog for a ride." So she shot him in the courtyard of their apartment complex in front of everybody. And she was very calm about it. Well, I thought he was going to hurt my dog. Sensational? Maybe a little. This got picked up by the AP and ran across the country. Now, imagine you're sitting at the breakfast table reading your breakfast, and you're Mrs. Nancy Craig, who was his wife, who was living in Atchison while he was in Kansas City shacking up with Bubbles. What? So Things get picked up by the AP all the time. Here's another one, shoot self with shotgun and pistol. You know, Edgar Tellis, who was losing his vision, was despondent over the fact that he was going blind, took a shotgun, put his toe in it, and tried to shoot himself. Well, he only shot off part of his jaw. And feeling that he needed to finish the job, he stumbles down the alley. You can read the article if you can see it. Stumbles down the alley towards the shed, pulls out the pistol, and finishes the job. Well, this long article details that his wife is living in, this happened in Lincoln, his wife was in Omaha, that he was staying with his mother and father, that his brother ran the local hardware store, and gives all kinds of personal family information, as well as the gory details of exactly how he ended his own life. So why was his wife living in Omaha, and why was he living in Lincoln? You know, a lot of questions that newspaper articles, sensational newspaper articles, will bring up. So we can't get away from using newspapers when we're talking about events, because sometimes the event is so huge, the coroner can't keep up. And when I show you my case study of the Harbaugh sisters from the Iroquois Theater fire, or the Eastland disaster, or the Plainfield tornado, they're dealing with so many bodies at once that all the coroner's inquest record says is died on this date because of this event, and there's no detail. Newspapers is where you have to turn for that actual detail, because the coroner's trying to process 844 bodies, 29 bodies, 714 bodies, that you're just getting the date and the name just to verify that they were part of the event. So newspapers are going to provide those details for you. Here's a year in review, so you kind of get the information on, Mrs. Robert C. Langley tells me that her obit ran in January 5th. Now I know where I'm going. The cowardly murder, the one of Christian Henney, he's one of my case studies, so I'll give you more information about Christian Henney in a little bit. Can you read the official death record one up there that's highlighted? It says Mary Crooks, 4 days, White City Incubator, July 15th. Might not necessarily be a sensational death, but what does that tell us? What's the White City? So we know right away, without even showing you the date of this newspaper article, we have a year. We know that this happened during the Columbian World Exposition. It also tells me that she was born prematurely, most likely, because they were testing incubators for the first time. They had these babies on display so that fairgoers could come in and see these rows of babies in the incubators during the World's Fair. They did it again in Chicago with the Century of Progress. And there was a novel that was written about it called The Hatbox Baby, where they talked about these babies who were in the incubators. So it's sensational in a sense that the World's Fair would put these babies on display, for fairgoers, for entertainment, and charge a fee. And they did charge a fee to get in to see the babies, and that money supposedly went towards the maintenance and upkeep of the incubators and to take care of the babies. Who knows how much of it was pocketed by the organization, but that could go right past unnoticed unless you knew, wait, I know what the White City is, and then start looking to see if other babies are listed as having died as part of the World's Fair. So sometimes things are under the radar, and sometimes they're tragic, but they have an air of sensationalism to them because of things like the World's Fair. So you can find, that's a really good story to be able to tell, is to be able to tell the history of the World's Fair and those babies, those Hatbox babies. Here's some more resources for you to use. Some of you might not have used some of these. The Ancestor Hunt and Elefind are aggregators. Basically what they do is they scour the web for free digital collections. So Chronicling America is going to show up in Ancestry Hunt and in Elefind. Google News is going to show up in these as well. So it's kind of a one place to stop and shop instead of having to go to 15 different places. But these are just free resources that you can use. You don't have to have a subscription to any of these. You can just go to them anytime and do a search. What I do want to say about Google News, how many of you have used Google News? While I absolutely love it, the problem with Google News is it's just like looking at microfilm. You can't search by name. There's not an every name index. You have to find the name of the paper because they're not by location. So if I'm looking for Aurora, it's showing me Aurora, Illinois, Aurora, Colorado. If I'm looking at Ottawa, it's showing me Ottawa, Illinois, and Ottawa, Canada. So you have to know the name of the paper, which can be rough. And you have to hope that they have the year that you're looking for. And if you have the year, do they have the date? So you have to choose the year, the month, the date, and then browse the issues, just like we would on microfilm. You can't print them. You can't download an issue and go through it. You have to do screenshots. So if anybody's listening, be sneaky and use screenshots. But you can't download Google News. So there's some great stuff in there, but you can't just browse. You have to know exactly what you're looking for in order to find it. So now I'm going to give you some case studies. Every death is unique, whether it's a sensational death or whether it's somebody who passes away in their sleep at an elderly age. Every source of records that you use for one event are not necessarily the sources that you're going to use for another event. So some of the case studies that I use here, I'm going to talk about certain resources because you'll use the same type of source, the same type of search. But each one of these is a unique event that's going to provide unique information and unique resources. So the Harbaugh sisters from Plainfield died tragically in the Iroquois Theater fire. So there were actually 3 sisters that were there at that event. Mary and Harriet both perished. They were school teachers. They had gone to the play. It was between Christmas and New Year's. It was December 30th. They had gone to the play while they were out on Christmas break. When the fire broke out, they were up in the gallery. So if any of you are familiar with the Iroquois Theater, when the fire spread, it kind of spread to the gallery very quickly. And there were hundreds of people who were up there at the time. So Harriet perished because she jumped. She was up, in the balcony in the gallery, and she jumped down to the parquet, hoping that she could survive the jump and get away from the fire. She didn't survive. Mary was still up in the gallery and was burned and had smoke inhalation. And the Iroquois Theater fire changed government regulations, because if you're familiar with the fire, you know that the doors opened in, not out. And ever since that fire, all fire doors open out so that you can evacuate quickly. That wasn't the case in the Iroquois Theater. They opened in. So Mary was one of those people who were trapped in the gallery because they couldn't get the doors open to get the people out, and she was severely burned. They had a huge funeral, attended from people from all over Plainfield as well as surrounding communities, and there's an article in the newspaper that details, in very specific detail, the funeral procession and the arrangements, the flowers, the songs that were sung, the people who came in from out of town. But there's never a headstone for them. So at Plainfield Township Cemetery, they're in an unmarked grave. In the Inner Ocean, which is probably the best newspaper source for this information at the time, they had the list of the dead and the unknown, as well as those who were injured. And you can see that both Mrs. Harbaughs are listed there. And it says here, address not known, jumped from gallery to the parquet circle. But for the other Mrs. Harbaugh, they don't give you any additional details. That detail comes from that book that I had highlighted when I showed you Internet Archives, the Chicago's Awful Theater Horror. And in that book, there's a section here about Mrs. Harbaugh. It should be Ms., not Mrs. But it says that as they were pulling the dead bodies away and throwing them into a pile to be taken for the inquest, she moved a little. So somebody saw her flinch or move, and they're telling you the story of pulling the bodies off of her so they can get to her to try to resuscitate her. Once they resuscitated her enough, they asked, what's your name? And all she could do was get out Mary Harbaugh. They took her to the hospital. She died 2 days later from her burns and from the smoke inhalation. So when I show you the inquest next, it didn't make it into the slides for the presentation for the web because I had to wait to get it from Cook County. But on the inquest, which I'll show you in a couple slides, again, just the bare bones information, the inquest lists them both as dying on the same day, which was actually not the case. So sometimes that information can be misleading. So like I said, anytime there's a disaster, there's always somebody to blame. The blame is fixed on the owners of the Iroquois Theater. Page after page after page in that issue of the Inner Ocean talks about, the injuries and the people who were killed, those who were listed as missing, the firemen who came in to try to save as many people as they could, and then as the weeks and the months went by, you get the details of the inquest, which wasn't held until January 25th. This went on for months as they did their investigation, and you would still see newspaper articles that went out for the 1st anniversary, the 5th anniversary, the 10th anniversary. This all started because there was a scrapbook that had this article in it about the Harbaugh girls. I found that after I found the book online. And again, it describes a little bit about the sisters, that there were handsome expressions of flowers and singing and everything that went on at the funeral, who the reverend was, where it was held, where they were buried. It gives a tremendous amount of information. I was able to use the Cyberdrive, Illinois coroner's inquest list that goes up to 1911. So I was able to find the volume and the page number to where I could find the original inquest. From there, I went to Northeastern Illinois University up off of Pulaski in Bryn Mawr to actually look at the original coroner's inquests for the Iroquois Theater fire. And again, very bare-boned. The same information provided for each and every person on that page. Their name, that it was the 30th, came to their death, because of the fire. So doesn't provide me any information, even though it's a coroner's inquest, which can provide a ton of information. But because of the scale of the event, it's nice to have the coroner's inquest, but it doesn't tell me anything. That's when I had to turn to newspapers like the Inner Ocean to find out that specific detail. And lucky enough, there was a book that was done by survivors, like I showed you, that give the explanation about her being found in the pile. How many of you have been to Showman's Rest out in Woodlawn Cemetery, out off of Des Plaines? Only a couple people, where the big elephants statues are. Many of you might have heard the story about how they suspected that the cemetery was haunted for a number of years because they would hear lions and tigers roar at night, thinking that it was the elephants and the animals that had perished in the circus train wreck, until some smart person said, "You realize that you're about 3 blocks away from Brookfield Zoo." Sounds scary at night, But this was a huge, sensational event. When the Hagenbeck-Wallace circus train accident happened in northern Indiana in 1918, this was a huge deal because it was a well-known circus. It was a tragic incident. It was done by neglect. It was done by error. There was an empty troop train, where the guy pretty much fell asleep at the wheel and wasn't paying any attention as he was coming into town and smashed into the back of the circus train, which was largely a wooden train at the time. And what started the fire of the circus train accident were the lanterns that were hanging in the sleeping cars, and this explosion and this roar of fire that took place after the initial collision, which caused an estimated, they can only estimate, they can't tell you exactly how many people died. You'll see anywhere from 78 to 94 estimated deaths that happened because of this train wreck, because bodies were unidentifiable. And the remainder of the people, they assumed were just cremated to ashes. So they think there's this many, because the people never came forward and said, "No, I'm fine, I'm okay." So they think that they had that many people, but nobody's quite sure. So there's some great information on this train accident in a number of different places. So Lake County Coroner held the inquests, into the event. Those records are available through the county. But the Hammond, Indiana Library, the public library, has an archives of the photos that were taken of the investigation during the investigation after the wreck. So they have photos from, the burials of the bodies that were done at Woodlawn. They've got pictures of the overturned train wreck. They've got a lot of information at the local library on this tragic event. The website at the bottom, the one from the New York Public Library, had a really nice collection of the circus posters. So you could find out information on the type of circus and the things they had. The photo here of Joe Coyle. Joe Coyle is probably one of the most tragic stories that comes out of the Hagenbeck-Wallace wreck, because Joe Coyle lost his whole family. So he, his wife, and his 2 young boys were both in one of the sleeper cars when the collision occurred. They found his son's body several hours later in the morning once the sun had come up, and his wife and his other son's bodies were never found. They think that they were just incinerated to nothing. And there's stories of Joe Coyle just collapsing to his knees, weeping, holding on to the body of his youngest son that they could find while he survived the wreck and everybody else perished. So Joe Coyle's story is really very heartbreaking, and it was the story that a lot of newspapers fixated on because he was a very real face, to the horrors that happened during the train wreck. So articles about the train wreck you can find picked up by the AP, but you can find a lot of information on Joe Coyle and his family because he became kind of that personal face to the tragedy of the train wreck. And I have 2 giveaways for you guys today at the end of the day, and one of them is the book about the Hagenbeck-Wallace train wreck. That's going to be one of the goodies that somebody gets to take home today. And it was done by the Hammond, Indiana librarian who wrote the book using what he had in the archives to tell the story of the event.
Where were they buried?
Some of them, about half of them, 55 of them, were buried at Woodlawn Cemetery, right off at Des Plaines. 22nd Street. So here are a couple of examples of the photos that came out from the Hammond, Indiana collection. And you can see that they're all put together. The problem with the train accident also is that a lot of these people didn't have names, or they had circus performer names. So if any of you have ever gone there and looked at the headstones, it'll just say male performer number 4, Baldy, female performer number 26, because they didn't have names. They couldn't identify necessarily who they were to say specifically and give them a specific name. So the section, the lot had actually just been purchased several months before from the circus community. They had bought this lot as a way for indigent circus performers to be buried. Never in a million years did they think that when they bought this plot, 55 people were going to go into it just a short time later. So it was a huge event that was picked up all around the U.S. So where did I get my resources? Here are some of the places I looked for that information. Like I said, Richard Little's book is the one that I've got for you today. Hammond, Indiana Public Library, DPLA, Digital Public Library, Circus World of Baraboo. Have any of you been up to Baraboo? More of you have been there than Woodlawn. We're taking a field trip. So Baraboo has information, but one of the places for information that I didn't put on my handout is that Illinois State University has a circus collection up on the top floor of the Milner Library. So that's another avenue of research, again, at a university where you normally wouldn't think to find circus information. So ISU has some information as well that I did not go there for this particular train wreck, but they have a lot as well. So now Errol Rockenbach was a local Plainfield boy. He was on board the USS Indianapolis when it went down. He was the only son. He had 6 sisters. He was the only boy in a household of 7. I feel for him. I couldn't imagine being the only boy in a household of all girls. And he was in the middle of the pack. He wasn't the oldest and he wasn't the youngest. But he was a farm boy. And he had joined the Navy during World War II, as many of them did, because it was his opportunity to see the world. He didn't want to be in the Army, because he didn't want to be at the front. So he thought if he was, in the Navy, he'd be a little safer and he'd still be able to do some travel. He enlisted in October of 1942. He was stationed at Great Lakes. From Great Lakes, he was sent out to San Diego. From there, he was assigned the USS Indianapolis in early 1943. The ship had just finished delivering. Some of you may be familiar with the USS Indianapolis. So the USS Indianapolis had just finished doing a quick run. It was one of the fastest runs they had ever done. They were delivering the atomic bomb, actually, is what they were doing, and they had delivered it, and they were just leaving. They were just south of Leyte Gulf when they were struck by an enemy torpedo, and the boat sank very quickly. The boat sank in less than an hour, I believe. There were 1,200 people on board. 800 men went into the water. They floated there for 5 days before they were rescued by the USS Cecil Doyle. It was about 313 or 315 men survived. The USS Indianapolis fell from social consciousness for a couple of decades. It was a big deal in the 40s and the 50s. By the late 60s and 70s, it had kind of faded into the background until when? Jaws. Jaws is the reason why the USS Indianapolis re-entered the social consciousness. So how many of you remember that scene where Quint is giving his 5-minute dialogue about what it was like and about slapping the water to keep the sharks at bay, right? A movie, right? But it's a very real scene in that movie that he's retelling, that he's portraying about that event that sticks in all of our minds to this day. How old is Jaws? He's like 78, 79, give or take, right? So almost 40 years ago, and yet that scene still is embedded in all of our memories, right? So thank you, Steven Spielberg, for bringing this back into the social consciousness. But hundreds of books have been written on the USS Indianapolis. Some of the most recent ones, In Harm's Way, Left for Dead, Fatal Voyage, Abandoned Ship, which is an older one, but very well done by Richard Newcomb. So there's been a lot written about the USS Indianapolis. And it's done a very good job of remaining in social context because of things like Jaws and because of books being written about it and because of things like the Veterans Oral History Project. So poor Earl, they never found his remains. He was declared dead, first presumed dead and then declared dead. His family was notified, and they had a memorial for him in Plainfield after the event, as you can see in September. So his remains were never returned. There's a marker for him at the Plainfield Township Cemetery, and there's a marker for him in the Philippines, along with a list of all the other men whose bodies were not recovered, who had gone down on the USS Indianapolis. But the newspaper article, his obit, gives all kinds of details about how he was just a ship's cook and where he had come from and how he was raised, and about how they were struck previously by a suicide bomber at Okinawa. So they had seen some very real action before the ship had gone down, July 30th, 1945. So I went to Fold 3 to be able to start investigating some of the other people who had been on board the ship. That's where I got the information about the burial and the marker that was in Manila. The Navy has a really good page on the Navy website about disasters, and sinking of the USS Indianapolis is one of them. So they do have several other World War I, World War II, Civil War information about naval disasters that are available through their website. How many of us would think to go directly to the Navy for that information? Not very many of us. We're going to go to genealogical sites. We're not necessarily going to go to historical sites. Internet Archives has several books on the USS Indianapolis available. But what they have on here is a video that somebody uploaded with an article about the Navy physician who was on board the ship that day and about what it was like going into the water and being in the water all those days until they were rescued several days later. And what was most horrifying to me watching this interview, he talks about how when the boat first went down and the boys were in the water, about how he was taking the dog tags, because they had life jackets on. And there were plenty of boys who didn't have life jackets. So as the body number was piling up, he would take off their dog tags and slide them onto his arm, and then take the life jacket off. They would sink, and he would give it to somebody who was clinging to somebody else. He said by that next morning he had so many dog tags on his arm he couldn't hold his arm up anymore, and he dropped them all. And just to watch this video of him telling that story is a very moving experience. You could just imagine how weighty that must have been in the water while he was trying to attend as physician to all of those men who were still alive. Find a Grave also was a place to go to find, not only did the Plainfield marker, was that there, but it also had a link in Find a Grave to the Manila marker as well, which provided some additional information. So those are the kind of places where you wouldn't normally think to go. Right, to the Navy, to Internet Archives, to Find a Grave necessarily, to find those resources. Ada Smith is another example. This one's close and personal to my heart. Ada Smith was a beautiful young lady. She truly was a very beautiful girl. She'd graduated from Plainfield High School. She was well loved by her friends and her family. She was in the choir. She was a very talented singer. Her boyfriend that she had been seeing for a couple of months lost interest and started stepping out with other young ladies. Ada never got over it. She was so heartbroken that in the middle of the night, she left her bed, went downstairs into the barnyard, opened up the horse trough, and drowned herself in 18 inches of water. You have to really mean it in order to drown yourself in 18 inches. Ada left a note. And in that note, she detailed, this is why I have done this. I'm sorry to my parents. And she even named her pallbearers in her suicide note. She listed exactly how she wanted her funeral to be arranged. Coroner's inquest was held several hours later. The young man is named and identified as Ralph Mather, who comes up in a lot of my other presentations because, boy, he made the news a lot. So I apologize to the Mather family who still live in town. Testified, we were never engaged. We weren't serious. So he had stopped calling on her the previous month. He was, just enjoying his youth and seeing other girls. Her death was ruled a suicide, according to the coroner. But poor little Ada's suicide in Plainfield in 1907. Plainfield had a population of 900 in 1907. Ada's suicide was picked up by the AP, and it ran in Oklahoma, and in Georgia, and in California, and in Maine. It got picked up and run all across the country. And what's interesting about the AP is that a lot of times you'll get the same newspaper blurb in 15 different newspapers, but then sometimes some newspapers would take the time to do a little further investigation, and you'd get a little more information out of some of those. So some of them would just say jilted by her lover. Some of them specifically said Ralph Mather and called him out in the newspapers. So it depends. So if it's a tragic event, if it's something that's picked up by the AP, don't stop at just one or two of those newspaper accounts. Look at all of them, because some of those papers took that little bit of extra time to add some additional detail. And as we've all seen, as events are unfolding live before our eyes, the story changes, right? You get more information, the death toll changes, the cause of the incident changes. So if you just look at one or two of the AP articles, you might be missing out on that detail that comes later that gives you the more specifics, the actual names, the actual details of the particular event. So there's Ada. Wasn't she a beautiful girl? And she was truly a beautiful young lady. The AP articles, takes life when love grows cold, give the details of it. Some of them, like I said, called him out specifically. Some of them did not. They talk about the sympathy of the family. She was one of several children. She was not an only child. She had several brothers and sisters. One of them says that, they were engaged to be married. Some of them, tell different stories. So by looking at all these different pieces, you're getting different little snippets of information. Ada Smith first came to my mind because the Plainfield Historical Society was looking to do their cemetery walk. How many of you have gone to cemetery walks? Right? So there's a lot of investigation and there's a lot of research that goes into who you choose when you do your cemetery walk. Ada was one of the people that Plainfield Historical Society had chosen to be one of their stops along their cemetery walk for that particular year. So they had come to me and said, find out everything you can. That was pretty easy. I was able to go and get a copy of the coroner's inquest. One of the newspaper accounts actually supplied, I should say, not resubmitted, but supplied a copy of her actual suicide note. Because that wasn't at the Historical Society, it wasn't in the coroner's inquest, but the newspaper had rerun, her suicide note. So we were able to find the information of exactly what this particular suicide note said. So, going to cemetery walks sometimes too. You might just decide to go because it's fun and exciting, but a lot of research goes into those, and sometimes you can find information about family and events in unexpected ways. So Christian Henney and the Crazed Bicyclist. I smile because this story is just unbelievable. So Christian Henney, this is Kendall County. Christian's tale is one of just unfortunate misunderstandings, miscommunications. So Christian Henney was driving his wagon home. He was in Aurora for the day. He's coming down Grove Road, if any of you are familiar with Kendall County. He's coming down Grove Road, and coming north as he's heading south is a bicyclist. Now you have to visualize this. We're not talking like Wizard of Oz, dint bicyclist. We're talking the great big wheels, the big high bikes with the big wheels, is riding down Grove Road. Christian thinks he gets over far enough so the bicyclist can pass. Well, he accidentally nudges him with a back wheel and knocks the gentleman off his bike. So the bicyclist gets back up, and proceeds north on Grove Road. Christian Henney thinks, oh, he's okay, and doesn't think anything of it. Well, the bicyclist apparently gets madder and madder as he starts thinking about it, so he turns around and pedals after him in his Christian Henney, who's in his wagon. This bicyclist comes charging after him. Henney stops. They have a bit of an argument, and the man shoots him in the stomach. Rides off on his bicycle, north to places unknown. Christian Henney rides his wagon to the nearest farmhouse. If you're familiar with living in the country, you know farmhouses are a half mile to a mile apart. Christian Henney gets to the porch of the first house, and he's doubled over because he's bleeding. So he knocks on the door, and he's slurring his words, and he says, can I see the man, can I see your husband? Can I talk to the man of the house? And the woman says, well, he's eating his supper. You're going to have to go away and come back later. So he stumbles back down the porch, gets in his wagon, and rides to the next closest farm. He gets to the front door, he knocks on the door, asks the wife to see his husband, and she's like, well, let me go get him, hold on just a second. So while he's sitting there waiting, he collapses on the front porch because he's bleeding to death. Man comes out, sees that he's dying and bleeding, calls the local doctor. While the doctor's en route, Christian Henney is relating his story of how he was shot and how he wound up on his front porch. The doctor gets there and he dies, he expires. So the coroner's inquest has the witnesses, gives his wife's name, gives the farmhouse name where the gentleman is living, says that he comes to his death by an unknown individual who shoots him with a gun. In the coroner's book, they included the full column front page newspaper article that was written in the Kendall County Record at the time. Because the inquest can only give you a little bit of detail, right? So they were smart enough to clip out that original article and include the whole article, telling about how his wife is completely besides herself, she has 2 young children, she's been nonsensical, they can't revive her, about this particular interest, about this particular article. The Little White School Museum had a file on the Henney family to tell us what happened next. Did she remarry? What happened to the girls? So on and so forth. Find a Grave had pictures of the headstones and also gave the detail of all the other Henney family that are buried in the Bristol Cemetery. Ancestry and Family Search provided details about his parents and the backgrounds of the family. So there were a lot of different places where I was able to get these little bits and pieces to tell the story of Christian Henney and his unfortunate demise. So here's the coroner's inquest record. It shows me that the physician that showed up on his doorstep, the people who were there, his housewife, the carpenter, the farmer, gives me the date, September 1898. But like I said, it also had that newspaper article. And what sells newspapers? Sensationalism. Isn't it true? Ads. Smart Alec. Sensationalism. So whether this is a true retelling of the story that Christian Henney told before he died on the farmer's front porch, or whether it is a sensationalized news account of what happened in that event, we won't know. But it's really good reading, and it really probably sold a lot of newspapers because Christian Henney was very well known within the community. So it was a very tragic event in small town America. So these types of things are the kind of information that you can use to tell that story. How many of you have situations like this where you've gone to the coroner, you're looking through inquest books, and you find these extra bits and pieces? Photos, newspaper articles, additional documentation. I'm the only one. You guys got to get out more. You guys got to come with me because I have a really good time going through coroner's inquest records. And I've been known to laugh, which sounds terrible, but I've been known to laugh from time to time when I'm reading inquest records, like the one about how he had the shirt and the pocket watch, but no pants. So, he must have been having a very good time. Any questions for me? I think I finished a few minutes early, so we can have lunch sooner.
How far back do coroner's inquest records go?
It depends on the state and it depends on the county. So Cook County, they're going to go back before the fire because those records managed to survive. Will County, they go back to 1865. Kendall County, they go back to 1864. It just depends on the individual county. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And what's great for us in Illinois is the fact that death records and birth records weren't kept until 1877. But coroner's records predate that. So if you're lucky enough that you had an ancestor who died in a very tragic way, that might be the only way that you're going to find that information, because there's not going to be any official state death certificate for it. Jerry?
On cremation now, a lot of times people, and this is probably in recent years, they get cremated and there's no stone necessary.
It's true.
I know a lot of times people put a stone in a cemetery, just so there's a place where somebody can find somebody's name for genealogy. Well, what's the, how is that handled in the record keeping between the, the cemeteries and the, the people that bury them?
Jerry had asked, for people who are cremated and whose remains might be scattered and they're not in a cemetery, where would you necessarily go to find that kind of information? I'll tell you a personal story. My best friend committed suicide 4 years ago, and his ashes were taken back down to Alabama, and they were spread. Because he committed suicide, there's a coroner's inquest for him, and the funeral that took care of the funeral home that took care of the arrangements, even though he was cremated, would have copies of the funeral home records. There is an obit. The obit basically said, died suddenly, doesn't provide any of that additional information. But when you see that, that should be your opportunity to then contact the coroner in that county. And in the coroner's records, it's usually going to tell you who the funeral home was. So one will lead you to the other. But I feel the same way about my best friend. I have no place where I can go to pay my respects to him. But I know that information, but when I go, who else is going to know that information? That's when you just need to rely on what you know.
People going to cemeteries much anymore.
No, not as much as we would like, but some people do place a marker, even if you spread remains somewhere else. So, cemeteries will charge you. Like, my dad was cremated, and he's buried on top of my grandpa. It was $600 just to file the paperwork with the cemetery, not even the cost of opening and closing the grave for his urn to go in the ground. Because he's buried on top of my grandpa has a military stone, and you cannot change a military stone. You cannot add a name to a military stone. And the cemetery had a limit of only 1 stone per lot. So my dad is completely unmarked, even though he's in that grave, because it's a military stone for my grandfather. So sometimes the only way to find that is by going into the cemetery office and asking to see the index card or the original records. So
So I guess a follow-up on that would be, in a normal cemetery, you could place another stone on top of the grave,
maybe.
maybe.
This was a Catholic cemetery, and I'm not going to go there right now. You know how I feel about those, Jerry. But yeah, sometimes the only place you're going to find that information is through the coroner, the funeral home, or the cemetery. Or if you're lucky enough to find an obit.
Back then, those high-wheeled bikes would have been not, prevalent. Why wasn't there an investigation of who had that type of a bike in that area?
Well, and there might have been, but it's not included in the jury verdict, and it's not included in the newspaper article. So they might have sent somebody out to ask, hey, do you know anybody who meets this description? It could have been somebody passing through, although you think Grove Road wouldn't be well traveled by people from other communities, but
The house that turned them away.
yeah, but supposedly he was never found. And it's in subsequent newspaper articles and stuff, nobody was ever arrested. Yeah.
This will be a where do I go next question, and if you want to answer it later instead of taking up their time, that'd be fine.
Okay.
My grandfather's sister was a teacher in Chicago at Throop School in on Adams. On December 30th, 1903, she went to see Mr. Beaird and never came out. If you look online on the coroner or the medical examiners, there's only one death certificate online, and it is hers. And I couldn't understand it for a while, so I found in a Bakersfield newspaper in California the fact that the deputy coroner, Buckley, knew her personally when her body was taken out. 2 policemen took her out, and they actually brought her back, and they used her as a stand-in for everybody else who died. So I did the same thing you did. I didn't go to Northeastern. I called them, and they sent it to me, and I already had the death certificate. should have been a coroner's report and inquest, but they destroy all that stuff. So I'm thinking now, I don't know whether, since they found her ticket in her pocket, they know where she was from, and I think it's the balcony. But I don't know whether smoke inhalation or crushed or fell or anything else. I do have her picture because they published a lot of the pictures the Chicago teachers did. And, so I'm probably thinking some kind of court records read, because the coroner and medical examiner's inquest certainly doesn't exist anymore.
As we saw, there's not much detail there. He had an ancestor who had died in the Iroquois Theater fire as well, and where to go next. Read those accounts out of the Inter-Ocean, like I showed, because the detail that the Inter-Ocean provided, Tribune did not provide as much detail, and I have not looked at the Chicago Daily News, but the Inter-Ocean really gave the best description of what was going on in the theater at the time, and then the subsequent investigations. So look at that, look at the 2 books that I mentioned in my presentation, because those are listing the people, like we saw, they're the personal accounts. So if somebody was sitting near her, they might be telling the story about her as an example of, this lady was sitting next to me and this was what her name was. And first person accounts are where you're gonna get that detail, because the coroner couldn't keep up.
So
It's a shame she was used as the example, but
Right, that's what it said in the paper anyway. Shouldn't there be some trial records then too, if they used her?
the question is whether or not it's in the federal court or whether it's in the local court. Because things like, the fire investigations and about the doors not opening out, I would check at National Archives on Pulaski. But then for the personal individual lawsuits, I would check the county. So I would contact Phil Costello. Sorry, Phil, if you get an inundation of calls. I'd check with the archives, the Dorothea Brown's office, the circuit court archives, to see if they have individual lawsuits. Now the problem is a lot of the court records for Cook County have been sampled, so they might not have everything, but they might have something. But between a federal investigation and individual lawsuits, you're looking in 2 different places for those records.
Okay, we can take one more question for the webinar. Miss Nancy?
Okay, I have 2 quick questions.
2?
2, because
One, they're real short. One, you mentioned that you can't add names onto a military stone. Well, wait a second. My late husband's an Abraham Lincoln, and he's on the front of it, and when I pass, I will be on the back of it.
Yes, yes.
Oh, you're just talking about the front of it.
Well, yes. So Nancy's question was, military stones, not being able to add names to it. Yes, spouse will go on the back because you will go in that plot. That's for a national cemetery. They're in a Catholic cemetery, and the Catholic cemetery will not allow me to make any changes to the military headstone. He doesn't have a tall stone. He's got a flat one.
Okay, and the second one was, I've heard of this Iroquois Theater. Was the show that the theater was showing, was that a play or was that a movie theater?
No, it was a play. It was like a musical. It was Bluebeard's. Yeah, Beaird. The Beaird troupe.
Oh, good.
Yeah, they were British, right?
Yeah.
They were from the UK, and this was just one stop on many. Yeah, and the theater was brand new. The theater had just opened, so this was kind of like their first big event, and then this is what happened.
Sort of like the Titanic in a theater form.
This event is not like the Titanic, though.
No, this event is
We
not.
are sailing along, smooth sailing.
It is fantastic, and it's wonderful. Okay, so
You and your canoe.
everybody, please give Tina Beaird a warm round of applause. She did a fantastic job.
We're on time.
Okay.
I'm on time.
Yes, you are on time.
She's off being on
Thank you very much for everybody who's watching us online. We hope that you'll join us.